Have you ever had that feeling that your life is just passing by in a blur? That's exactly how I felt that Thursday. My name is Genevieve, and I'm going to tell you about the most mind-blowing night of my life. A night that changed everything I thought I knew about myself. I've worked as a financial analyst for 5 years. Numbers, spreadsheets, endless meetings. The same routine every single day. Wake up, coffee, subway, office, home, sleep. Repeat. I was feeling like a robot programmed to function without really living. That night, I left the office later than usual. My head was pounding with the pressures of the quarterly close. As I walked down the street I always took, I stopped in front of that bar. The Velvet Shadow. I passed by it almost every day, watching people going in and out, laughing, living. But I had never gone in. Why not? I thought. The question echoed in my mind like a challenge. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and was enveloped by an atmosphere completely different from the world outside. Dim amber lights danced across the exposed brick walls. The air carried a peculiar mix of citrus and wood polish, with notes of fine spirits and expensive perfumes. My heart raced. It was like I had crossed some kind of portal into another dimension. One where I could be anyone. Where no one knew the Genevieve of spreadsheets and deadlines. The bar wasn't crowded, but it had just enough life. Conversations in low tones, restrained laughter, the clinking of ice in glasses. Jazz music played softly in the background. Melancholic saxophone mixed with piano. As I approached the polished wooden counter, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Like something was about to happen. Like the universe was conspiring for that moment. I didn't know it yet, but that impulsive decision to walk into the Velvet Shadow would be just the first step of a night that would test all my limits. A night that would make me feel more alive than I ever imagined possible. And it was there, sitting on that leather stool, that I met the most piercing eyes I had ever seen. If you want to find out what happens when Genevieve meets those piercing eyes at the Velvet Shadow, there's only one thing to do. Click the subscribe button right now and hit the notification bell. Those eyes belonged to the person behind the counter. The bartender, or rather, the female bartender. Elizabeth. A name that didn't quite fit that imposing presence, but somehow made perfect sense when she smiled at me. "First time here?" she asked, as she dried a glass with precise movements. Her voice caught me off guard, deep, but smooth like pure honey dripping slowly. The kind of voice you feel as much as you hear. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, feeling my cheeks flush. Elizabeth laughed, a low, captivating sound. She leaned her arms on the counter, and I couldn't help but notice how strong they were, defined like a lumberjack's, contrasting with the delicacy of her movements. The sleeves of her rolled-up black shirt revealed tattoos that snaked up her forearms. "What'll you have?" she asked, studying me with an intensity that should have made me uncomfortable, but strangely didn't. "Surprise me," I challenged, surprised at my own boldness. As she prepared my drink, Elizabeth started asking questions. Not the typical superficial ones that strangers exchange, but questions that seemed to unravel layers that even I hadn't explored in years. About abandoned dreams, secret fears, little joys. As if she could see beyond the facade that I presented to the world. "Did you always want to work with numbers, or did they just happen in your life?" she asked as she slid a red amber drink toward me. I froze. How did she know? I hadn't mentioned my job. "Your wristwatch," she explained, pointing to my digital watch with a calculator. "And the way you organized your things on the counter. Methodical." When our hands touched as I picked up the drink, I felt an electric current run through my body. Our eyes met for a second longer than would be appropriate between strangers. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Not as the competent and serious Genevieve from the office, but as the woman who existed beneath all those layers. I caught myself laughing in a relaxed way, like when I was younger, before the responsibilities weighed on my shoulders. Elizabeth had that effect. As if time around her worked differently. As if the world outside didn't matter. I was so absorbed in that unexpected connection that I barely noticed when the bar door opened, bringing a new presence that would completely change the course of that night. The door to the Velvet Shadow opened with a soft creak, letting in a gust of cold night air and, with it, him. I didn't need to turn around to feel his presence. It was as if the very air in the bar had changed density. Elizabeth stopped in the middle of a sentence, her eyes fixed on the figure now approaching the counter. I followed her gaze and almost choked on my drink. Messy blonde hair as if he had just gotten out of someone's bed, a black leather jacket that seemed tailor-made for those broad shoulders. He moved with the predatory grace of someone completely at ease in his own body. Each step calculated, unhurried. He chose the stool next to me, leaving only one empty seat between us. Close enough for me to smell his cologne, a mix of leather, some expensive fragrance, and something primally masculine that I couldn't quite identify. Whiskey. Neat, he ordered from Elizabeth, his voice deep and slightly raspy, like it held secrets. Elizabeth nodded, her face now a professional mask, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders as she poured the drink. Something was going on there, an untold story between them. The newcomer swiveled the stool slightly in my direction, and I could finally see his face completely. Angular features, a thin, almost imperceptible scar above his left eyebrow, and eyes. Eyes of such an intense blue that they seemed unreal under the bar's amber light. "George," he introduced himself simply, raising his glass toward me in a silent toast before taking a sip. He didn't extend his hand, didn't ask my name. He didn't need to. There was a confidence about him that filled the entire room, as if he knew exactly the effect he had on people. On me. When he finally smiled, I felt my stomach flip. It was the kind of smile that carried dangerous promises. Trouble in all the best possible ways. "It's her first time here," Elizabeth commented, breaking the loaded silence, her voice now with an edge of something that sounded almost like possessiveness. George raised an eyebrow, his gaze traveling slowly across my face, neck, before landing briefly on my hands, which were gripping the glass tighter than necessary. "Lucky me, then," he replied, not taking his eyes off me. And so, in a matter of minutes, what was a night of solitary discovery had transformed into something completely different. Something charged with possibilities that left me breathless. What do you think of this situation? Genevieve is in an unfamiliar bar, torn between the unexpected connection with Elizabeth and the magnetic arrival of George. Where do you think this night is headed? Comment below. The air in the velvet shadow became charged, like before a storm. I was at the center of something I didn't fully understand, but that made my heart beat faster, my skin become hypersensitive. Elizabeth turned her attention to me with renewed intensity. Her movements behind the counter became more deliberate, almost performative. I noticed how she leaned closer to me, ignoring other customers waiting for drinks. "So, Genevieve," my name rolled off her lips like a caress. "What are you really looking for when you ditch work on a Thursday night?" The question, far more direct and personal than the previous ones, caught me off guard. Before I could answer, George interjected. "Maybe she's not running away." His voice slid between us like dark silk. "Maybe she's searching." Elizabeth shot a sharp glance at George. "I think she can answer for herself." George just smiled, that dangerous smile, and took another sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe a little of both," I finally replied, surprising myself with the honesty. "Running away from the monotony. Searching for something that makes me feel." "Feel what?" They both asked, almost in unison, and then exchanged glances that could cut glass. The tension between them was palpable, old, laden with history. But there was something new now, me. Somehow, I had become the prize in an unspoken competition. Elizabeth began to tell me stories of eccentric customers, each ending with a question that made me reveal more about myself. George, in turn, made occasional comments, each perfectly timed to divert my attention, each word chosen to hint at possibilities. It was an electric back and forth. When Elizabeth touched my hand as she exchanged my glass, George moved closer a stool, narrowing the space between us. When George whispered something that made me blush, Elizabeth found an excuse to lean over the counter, revealing more of her tattoo that snaked up her neck. I felt intoxicated, and not from the 2 drinks I had consumed. It was the attention, the blatant desire in both their eyes, the feeling of power that I had never experienced before. "Do you always do this?" I finally asked, looking from one to the other. "Do what?" Elizabeth asked, feigning innocence. Compete for the same person, I replied, surprising them both with my bluntness. A heavy silence fell over the three of us. The game had been exposed. The cards revealed. And then, something unexpected happened. They smiled. Not at each other, but at me. As if I had passed some test I didn't know I was taking. Those twin smiles completely disarmed me. There was something predatory about them, yes, but also an invitation. A challenge. And for the first time in years, I felt like accepting a challenge without calculating all the risks. So? George broke the silence, swirling the empty glass between his fingers. What's it going to be, Genevieve? Elizabeth crossed her arms, the defined muscles stretching the fabric of her shirt. Yeah, we're curious to hear your choice. The bar around us seemed to have disappeared. The soft jazz in the background, the other conversations, everything turned into a distant blur. There was just the three of us in that bubble of tension and possibilities. I took the last sip of my drink, feeling the alcohol warm my throat and unleash something inside me. Something that the old Genevieve, predictable, cautious, always in control, kept firmly locked away. What if? I started, my voice steadier than I expected. What if I don't want to choose? They both looked at me with identical expressions of surprise. I leaned slightly forward, lowering my voice. Why not both? The words came out before I could censor them. Just hearing my own voice utter that suggestion made my cheeks flush intensely. I had never been so bold, so direct. I had never even considered something like that. Time seemed to freeze. I saw Elizabeth hold her breath, her eyes darkening. George was perfectly still, just a muscle in his jaw twitching slightly. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. What was I doing? This wasn't me. The Genevieve I knew would never suggest something so impulsive, so outside the lines she had followed her whole life. But maybe that was exactly the point. Maybe I was tired of being that Genevieve. Interesting, George murmured, leaning in toward me until I could feel his warm breath on my ear. Very interesting. Elizabeth let out a low, surprisingly melodious laugh. Well, that's unexpected. Their eyes met over my head, some kind of silent communication passing between them. For a moment, I feared I had made a terrible mistake, had misread the entire situation. Then Elizabeth reached out over the counter, her fingers brushing against mine. My shift ends in 10 minutes. George stood up, tossing some bills on the counter. I'll get my car. Meet you at the back exit. And so, with a few impulsive words, I had completely altered the course of my night. Of my life, maybe. The next 10 minutes passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. I waited outside, the cold night air partially clearing my mind, giving me moments of doubt that were quickly swept away by a surge of adrenaline. George's car, a sleek, discreet black sedan, slid silently down the street. Elizabeth came out the back door a few seconds later, now without her bar apron, just her black shirt and dark jeans that perfectly outlined her silhouette. The drive was short and loaded with silent tension. No one spoke much, but the glances exchanged in the rearview mirror and the accidental touches, when the car went around a corner, said everything. Elizabeth's apartment was in an old exposed brick building, one of those with fire escapes on the facade. 3rd floor, no elevator. Each step we climbed increased the pressure in my chest, as if the air was getting thinner the closer we got to her door. Welcome, Elizabeth said, turning the key in the old lock. The space that was revealed was surprisingly inviting. A large room with tall windows, partially covered by heavy curtains. A worn brown leather couch, one of those that tells stories. A bookshelf filled with vinyl records organized meticulously. Some well cared for plants in the corners. The smell hit me immediately. Cedar and laundry detergent, with subtle notes of something that reminded me of cinnamon. It was a comforting and yet strangely intimate aroma, as if I were invading a very personal space. George walked in right behind me, passing by us as if he owned the place. He took off his jacket and threw it over a chair, went to a small liquor cabinet in the corner, and poured himself a drink without asking permission. Still got that bourbon I like, he commented casually, as if he had been there last week. Elizabeth just smiled, a smile full of shared history that made me question again what kind of relationship they had. Genevieve? George raised a bottle in my direction. A drink to calm your nerves? I shook my head, refusing. I wanted to be completely present for whatever was going to happen next. Elizabeth moved behind me, closing the door with a soft click. That simple sound, the lock snapping into place, reverberated inside me like distant thunder. A game changer. The point of no return. So, she said, her voice lower now that we were in her territory. You still want both? Their eyes met George's over my shoulder, and again that silent communication flowed between them. Something old, familiar, but now with a new element. Me. Should the financial analyst follow her instincts and dive into this adventure with Elizabeth and George? Or should she reconsider and return to the safety of her predictable life? Let us know in the comments what you would do in her place. Yes, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. I still do. Elizabeth smiled, that smile that I now recognized as dangerously seductive, and guided me to the couch. The soft leather gave way under my weight as I sat down, a contrast to the tension that ran through every inch of my body. The couch was the only soft thing in that room. Everything else was pure electricity. Elizabeth positioned herself in front of me, kneeling with feline grace. Her hands landed on my thighs, the warmth of her palms penetrating through the fabric of my skirt. Her eyes never left mine, as if she wanted to memorize every reaction, every subtle change in my expression. I felt the couch dip slightly as George moved behind me. His strong hands landed on my shoulders, his thumbs making small circles at the base of my neck. A shiver ran down my spine. Relax, George whispered in my ear, his warm breath causing my eyes to close for a moment. We're just getting started. Elizabeth's hand slid a few inches up my thighs as she leaned forward. Her perfume, something citrusy and woody, invaded my senses as her lips gently touched mine. A tentative, almost reverent kiss that contrasted with the intensity of her gaze. At the same time, I felt George's lips on my neck, placing light kisses that left a trail of fire on my skin. His hands moved down my arms, fingers tracing invisible patterns that made me tremble. Elizabeth deepened the kiss, one hand rising to hold my face while the other remained firm on my thigh. George, in turn, pushed my hair aside to have better access to my neck, his teeth lightly grazing the sensitive skin below my ear. My mind was in turmoil, overwhelmed with sensations coming from all directions. Elizabeth's hands, now exploring my waist, sliding under my blouse. George's lips on my shoulder, after gently pushing aside the fabric. The contrast between her softness and his firmness. You're even more beautiful like this, Elizabeth murmured against my lips, completely surrendered. George chuckled softly, the sound vibrating against my skin. She's not completely surrendered yet, he countered, his fingers drawing ever-widening circles on my back. But she will be. I opened my eyes to find them both watching me with an intensity that should have scared me, but only intensified the heat growing inside me. There was something almost predatory in their combined gazes, as if I were a prey they had hunted together. And, surprisingly, I wanted to be captured. As the minutes unfolded in that room lit only by a distant lamp, I began to notice how Elizabeth and George were fundamentally different in their approaches. It was like being caught between two different types of perfection, each affecting me in completely distinct ways. George maintained a firm but controlled grip on every touch. His fingers pressed against my skin with calculated precision, as if he were constantly holding back, keeping something wild under tight control. There was a restraint in his movements that only intensified the effect they had on me, the promise of what could happen if that control broke. His stubble grazed against my shoulder as his lips traced a slow path to my collarbone, the rough texture creating a delicious contrast with the softness of his kisses. Every time I sighed or shuddered, I felt his smile against my skin, as if my reaction was exactly what he expected. Elizabeth was the complete opposite. Direct, without hesitation, her movements flowed with an almost brutal honesty. There was nothing contained in her approach. She took what she wanted with a confidence that left me breathless. Her hands slid over my body with clear purpose, her eyes never leaving mine, as if she wanted to witness every wave of pleasure she caused. You like this, Elizabeth murmured, not a question, but a statement, as her hands explored places that made my breath catch in my throat. "She likes it even more when we do this," George replied, his fingers finding a particularly sensitive spot on my nape, making my head fall back involuntarily. It was disconcerting how they seemed to communicate without words, anticipating each other's movements, creating a perfect choreography around me. As if they had done this before. Many times. "You," I started, but lost my train of thought when Elizabeth slid closer, pressing her body against mine while George nibbled on my earlobe. "We what?" Elizabeth teased, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "You've done this before," I managed to say finally. "Together." George chuckled softly, the sound reverberating against my skin. "We're old friends." "With a long history," Elizabeth completed, exchanging a loaded look with George. There was something in that look, an old intimacy, a shared knowledge, that made me feel momentarily like an intruder. But then, as if they read my thoughts, they both turned their full attention back to me, enveloping me again in their synchronized dance of touches and sensations. "But tonight," George whispered, "is about you. But before we reveal what happens next, we want to know, are you invested in this electrifying story? Are you feeling the tension build as Genevieve gives in to this unexpected night with Elizabeth and George? If so, don't hesitate. Show your support by clicking the like button right now." The world around me began to disappear. The apartment, the city outside, my everyday life. Everything dissolved until all that was left was that moment, that couch, those two bodies moving in perfect harmony around mine. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. Each sensation amplified, each touch reverberating through me like ripples in a lake. I had never experienced anything like it. It was as if my body was awakening from a long sleep. Elizabeth slid behind me, while George took her place in front of me. The transition was so fluid, so perfectly executed that I barely noticed the change until I felt the contrast between the two bodies. Their movements were impeccably coordinated, as if they had choreographed every moment, every touch, every kiss. "Breathe," Elizabeth whispered in my ear, her hands gliding over my waist. The strength I had noticed in her arms at the bar was now tempered with a surprising gentleness, her fingers tracing patterns that made my skin burn. George leaned forward, his blue eyes fixed on mine as his hands held my face with a delicacy that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. "Are you with us?" he asked, his voice raspier than before. I nodded, unable to form words. I was completely present, more aware of my own body than I had ever been. What followed was like a perfect symphony, each movement precisely timed, each sensation building upon the previous one. Elizabeth's hands in my hair, George's lips on my skin, the warmth of their bodies enveloping mine. I realized that all that nervous energy from before had disappeared. There was no more anxiety, no doubt, no constant feeling of being out of place that had plagued me in my daily life. There was only the present moment, pure and crystalline in its intensity. Elizabeth murmured something in my ear that I couldn't understand, but the tone of her voice, low, almost reverent, sent shivers down my spine. George responded with a guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of his being. They moved as if they were extensions of each other, as if they shared a single mind divided into two bodies. And I was at the center of that universe they had created, being undone and rebuilt by their skilled hands. "You're perfect," George murmured against my lips. "Exactly as we imagined," Elizabeth completed, her fingers tracing my spine. That phrase, "as we imagined," should have set off some alarm bells in my mind. But I was too lost in the storm of sensations to question anything at that moment. Time lost all meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. There was no way to know, nor did I care. There were only sensations. Hands, lips, warmth. The outside world simply vanished, replaced by a universe made up only of the three of us and the space between our bodies, which diminished with each passing moment. The leather couch creaked softly under our combined weight, creating a strange background music along with the sound of our increasingly rapid breathing. The friction of skin against skin generated a heat that seemed to radiate from the center of my being, spreading to the tips of my fingers. Elizabeth murmured words of encouragement in my ear, her normally steady voice now trembling with an emotion I couldn't name. George kept his eyes fixed on mine, even in the most intense moments, as if he wanted to memorize every expression, every sigh. "You're safe with us," Elizabeth whispered, her hands holding mine. "Let go," George completed, his voice an octave lower than normal. And I allowed myself to. I allowed myself to abandon the control I held so rigidly in every aspect of my life. I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be felt completely. The sound that escaped my throat was unrecognizable to my own ears. Primitive, honest, stripped of any inhibition. I saw a smile of satisfaction spread across George's face, felt the grip of Elizabeth's hands intensify. Waves of pleasure washed over me, one after another, as if my body was an instrument being played by perfectly synchronized musicians. Each touch was precisely where I needed it, each movement exactly in the right rhythm. It was an endless moment that somehow still ended too soon. When I finally came to, I was lying between them on the now completely disheveled couch, my head resting on George's shoulder, my legs intertwined with Elizabeth's. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but loaded with something I couldn't identify. An intimacy that went beyond the physical, as if we had shared not only our bodies, but pieces of our souls. Elizabeth was the first to move, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. "You're amazing, Genevieve," she murmured, her voice hoarse. George made a sound of agreement, his fingers toying distractedly with my hair. Exactly what we needed. Again, that phrase should have sparked some curiosity, some questioning. But I was floating in such a deep state of contentment that I just smiled, absorbing the warmth of their bodies against mine, feeling strangely complete. The apartment was quiet now, except for the soft sound of our breathing gradually returning to normal and the occasional noise of the city outside, a distant reminder that the world still existed beyond those walls. We lay in silence for some time, our bodies intertwined as we caught our breath. The only sound in the apartment was our breathing gradually slowing down and the occasional traffic noise outside, reminding me that a world existed beyond those walls. Elizabeth was the first to move, gently untangling herself from us. "I'll get some water," she said, her voice still carrying a slight tremor. I watched her walk away, the confidence in her movements even completely exposed. There was no shame, no hesitation, just a naturalness that I envied. George remained by my side, one arm still casually around my waist, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his blue eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me blush again, despite the intimacy we had just shared. I nodded, surprised to realize that I was more than okay. I was present, completely in the moment, without the constant anxiety that usually buzzed in the back of my mind. Elizabeth returned from the kitchen with 3 glasses of water. She handed one to George, who sat up to drink, and then knelt beside me, offering me the second glass. As I took it, her fingers brushed against mine in a way that said it all. Not an accidental touch, but a deliberate caress, a silent promise. "Thank you," I murmured, "not just for the water." She smiled, that smile that I now knew so well, and sat down on the floor next to the couch, her back resting against the seat where I was lying. A comfortable silence fell over us. There was no need for awkward words or clumsy explanations. There was a mutual understanding about the nature of our encounter. Something extraordinary, but contained to that night, that moment. "I've never done anything like this before," I confessed finally, breaking the silence. George chuckled softly. We could tell. Elizabeth patted my hand lightly. That's why it was so special. There was something in the way they looked at each other, a flash of silent communication, that made me think that maybe I wasn't the first to be in that position. But strangely, it didn't bother me. There was a sense of having been chosen, carefully selected, that was surprisingly flattering. "Do you do this often?" I asked, the curiosity finally outweighing the post-ecstasy contentment. Elizabeth took a sip of water, her eyes meeting George's over the glass. "Not often," she replied carefully. "Only when we find someone special." "Someone who fits," George completed, his fingers still toying distractedly with my hair. Again, that feeling of having been chosen, evaluated, and approved. I should have felt objectified, maybe, but instead, I felt a strange sense of pride. The clock on the wall read almost 3 in the morning when George finally stood up, stretching like a large cat waking from a nap. His muscles moved under his skin with a predatory grace that still fascinated me, even after everything we had shared. "I gotta go," he announced, locating his clothes scattered on the floor and putting them on with efficient movements. "Early meeting tomorrow." There was something surreal about seeing him transform back into the sleek man who had walked into the bar hours ago. As if he were putting on not just clothes, but an entire persona. Elizabeth nodded, as if she expected it. "You always do," she commented, a slight hint of teasing in her voice. George smiled, grabbing his leather jacket from the back of the chair and sliding it over his shoulders. The sound of the leather creaking softly sent a shiver down my spine, bringing back vivid memories of the night. He approached where I was, now sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket that Elizabeth had brought. He leaned down, his blue eyes fixed on mine. "Don't get too comfortable without me," he teased, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Then, surprisingly gently, he pressed his lips against my temple in a kiss almost chaste compared to what we had shared before. When he pulled away, his scent lingered, that incredible mix of leather and whiskey that would now forever be associated in my mind with this night, with this version of myself that I never knew existed. Elizabeth walked him to the door. I heard the murmur of their voices, too low to distinguish words, but the tone was one of familiar intimacy, confirming my suspicion of a long, shared history. The door closed, and for a moment the apartment seemed strangely empty, despite Elizabeth's continued presence. She turned back to the room, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "You okay?" she asked, sitting down next to me on the couch, maintaining a respectful distance that hadn't existed minutes before. "I am," I replied, surprised to realize it was true. There was no regret, just a strange sense of clarity, as if I had awakened from a long dream. We sat in comfortable silence for a few more minutes before I, too, began to gather my clothes. Elizabeth didn't try to convince me to stay, and somehow that felt right. The enchantment of the night was dissolving naturally, with no need to artificially prolong it. When I was finally dressed and ready to leave, Elizabeth walked me to the door. Her fingers touched my arm lightly. "Be careful," she said, her words carrying a weight that seemed odd for the situation. Something in her tone made me pause. "Of what?" She smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Out there. It's late." I nodded, although I felt like there was something more to her warning, something that wasn't being said. Final reflections. The night enveloped me as I left the building. The cold air brought clarity after hours of intense sensations. Empty streets, just occasional taxis and solitary figures hurrying by. I preferred to walk rather than call a taxi. I wanted to feel my body, to process what had happened. Each step reconnected me to reality, although my pulse was still racing from their touch, my skin holding the memory of their caresses. The city seemed more alive and vibrant. The lights of the street lamps reflected on the wet asphalt, even the distant sirens sounded almost musical. My senses seemed amplified, tuned to a new frequency. I questioned whether I had crossed a point of no return, whether the Genevieve who walked into that bar still existed. I felt no regret, but something fundamental had shifted within me. My reflection in a shop window surprised me. Externally the same, maybe with a new glint in my eyes, but nothing that revealed the storm of sensations I had experienced. Elizabeth's warning, "Be careful," echoed in my mind with a deeper meaning that I couldn't decipher. As I recognized my neighborhood, reality began to creep in: work, emails, routine. But instead of the usual weight, I felt a strange peace. The night had given me not only pleasure, but liberation. I decided not to overanalyze. Just let myself be carried by this experience, carrying it as a precious secret. What if Elizabeth and George reappeared? Surprisingly, the thought caused me not fear, but a shiver of anticipation. I entered my apartment with new eyes, seeing it not as a refuge, but as a place of unexplored possibilities. What did you think of the story? How did you feel witnessing this financial analyst completely step outside of her comfort zone and give in to such an intense experience with two strangers? Your opinion is very important to us. So take this moment to reflect and share your thoughts in the comments.